She had 177 contacts with the domestic abuse helpline. She visited her GP with bruises, broken blood vessels, difficulty swallowing. She told a police safeguarding officer she believed her husband was a psychopath who would find her no matter where she ran. And yet, on the 28th of November 2017, Tarryn Baird was found dead in the garage of the home she shared with her husband in Swindon, England. She was 34 years old. The world would not hear her full story for nearly a decade. Tarryn Baird grew up in South Africa, and it was there that she first encountered the man who would one day become her husband. Christopher Tribus was also South African, driven, ambitious, a man who would go on to build a career as a software consultant. By the time both Tarryn and Christopher emigrated to the United Kingdom in 2007, they were not yet in a romantic relationship. They had simply made the crossing together, two people from the same place, landing in the same new country. That would change. In October 2009, Tarryn and Christopher married in South Africa, then returned together to the UK the same year. Shortly after, Tarryn's mother Michelle, her father Alan, and her brother Greg followed, relocating to Swindon to be near her. It was the kind of thing a family does when they love someone. They follow her across the world. Looking back now, you wonder if some part of Michelle already sensed that her daughter might need her close. To those on the outside, Christopher and Tarryn appeared to be building a stable life. Christopher ran his IT company, travelling abroad regularly for work. Tarryn, who had initially worked with her mother in a recruitment business, moved across to work in her husband's software development firm. She was diligent. She supported them. She regularly wired money to extended family still back home in South Africa. On the surface, she was a woman in control of her life, contributing, present, cared for. That was what the surface showed. But there are things that surfaces are designed to hide. Tarryn's mother Michelle would later stand in a courtroom and describe, piece by piece, what daily life actually looked like inside that Swindon home. What she described was not a marriage. It was a system. Tarryn was required to follow a rigid routine. Lunch had to be prepared and placed on the table at exactly 12:15 every afternoon. Tea time came with its own set of expectations, and if Tarryn needed to leave the house, to drive somewhere, to visit her mother, to do anything at all that required a key, she first had to ask permission. The house keys and the car keys were kept locked inside a drawer in Christopher's private office. She asked, he decided. That was the arrangement. Michelle noticed the bruises. She saw them on her daughter's body during visits and said nothing at first, the way mothers sometimes don't, because to name it would be to make it real, and to make it real would mean the person you love is living inside something you cannot yet understand. But the bruises kept appearing, and Tarryn's explanations grew thinner each time. Christopher, for his part, had also been speaking to Michelle, but about something else entirely. He had told his mother-in-law that Tarryn was addicted to drugs and alcohol. He planted the seed carefully, deliberately, and prosecutors would later point to this as a textbook maneuver. Tell the family their daughter is unstable before she gets the chance to tell them what is really happening. That way, if she speaks, no one believes her. The prosecution at trial would describe what was happening inside that house as a tsunami. The word was chosen carefully. A tsunami does not begin with noise. It begins beneath the surface, silent and building, and by the time anyone on shore can see it, it is already too late to run. Tarryn had already been running for a long time. She just hadn't been able to get far enough. Tarryn Baird kept a diary, not a casual one, a detailed private record of what was being done to her, written in her own hand, as if she understood that one day someone might need it. Reading those entries in the years after her death would become one of the most harrowing parts of the entire case. In one entry from June 2016, Tarryn wrote about a night during which Christopher had placed his hands around her neck. She wrote, The more I fight back, the more he enjoys it. She described feeling something shift in him that night. Something that had been waiting just below the surface coming loose. She put it into words as precisely as she could, as if the act of naming it made it slightly less powerful. It did not make her safer, but it created a record. Around this time, in May 2016, Tarryn visited her GP and told her she occasionally felt life was not worth living. By August, she was describing herself as struggling. Her GP documented these visits meticulously and would later tell the court about her patient's horrific injuries, including bruising around the neck, difficulty swallowing, and swelling that had no innocent explanation. On one occasion, Dr. Jones noted bruising around Tarryn's neck following what Tarryn described as a sexual encounter during which Christopher had put his hands around her throat. The GP recorded clearly that Tarryn did not want him to do that. In October 2016, Tarryn told her doctor that Christopher had raped her following an argument about money, grabbing her wrists, forcing himself on her, and striking her with what she believed was a phone. That same month and the following one, November 2016, would form the basis of 2 rape charges against Christopher Tribus years later. Medical records also revealed that Tarryn had told professionals she had fainted on multiple occasions, once on the landing, once in the shower, following what Christopher described as consensual rough sex. She had bruises across her abdomen that a forensic physician would later compare to injuries seen in car crash victims. Professor Margaret Stark, a specialist who had worked in her field since 1989, told the jury she had rarely, if ever, seen abdominal injuries like the ones Tarryn sustained. The defense argued every single one of them was self-inflicted. Taran Baird had also been receiving support from Swindon Women's Aid. Between September 2015 and her death, she made 177 contacts with that organisation. She was referred to the Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference, a forum for the highest risk domestic abuse cases. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. She was flagged. She was seen. The pieces of the picture were being assembled by professionals around her, but there was a problem, a painful and tragically familiar one. A lack of available refuge space at critical moments meant that when Tarryn needed somewhere to go, there was nowhere to send her. She had tried to leave. The court would hear that Christopher stopped her from attending a refuge on at least one occasion. And when she did briefly manage to get away, staying at a hotel after changing her phone, withdrawing cash, and avoiding her car to prevent being found, Christopher appeared anyway. A police safeguarding officer named Lisa Attry told the court that Tarryn had confided in her about that moment, with visible fear. He had found her even after she took every precaution she knew how to take. Christopher Tribus was a software consultant. He had developed his own tracking software, and he had apparently used it on his wife. Tarryn told Lisa Attry she believed her husband was a psychopath. She told her she was afraid of the consequences if he found out she had spoken to police. She told a women's aid worker that the violence had escalated and that she could not believe she was still alive. She was not being dramatic. She was being precise. What happened next would haunt the people who had tried to help her for the rest of their lives. 2 weeks before Tarryn died, her mother Michelle sat in a room with her daughter and her son-in-law. What was said in that room would later be repeated to a jury at Winchester Crown Court, and it stopped the courtroom cold. Tarryn turned to her mother and asked if she had told her what Christopher had said he would do to her. Michelle said she had not. So Tarryn told her Christopher had said he would snap her neck in a heartbeat, cut up her body, dissolve it in acid, and that no one would ever find her. Michelle, in court, described asking Christopher directly whether he was sick. She told him that if she couldn't find her daughter, she would come looking for him. Tarryn, according to Michelle, smiled at that and said, "I told you my mum would say that." And then Christopher laughed. He would later say in court that the whole conversation had been a joke, a reference to the television program Breaking Bad. The jury would be left to decide what kind of man laughs while describing to his wife's mother how he would dissolve her body in acid. Taran Bair did not go to a refuge in those final 2 weeks. She did not leave. prosecution counsel would argue at trial that she could never bring herself to go through with leaving him, not because she did not want to, but because she knew what leaving meant. She had seen what he was capable of. She had tried to escape and been found. She had told professionals she feared the consequences. She had written it down in her diary. She had made 107 phone calls to a domestic abuse service. And still she stayed, not because she chose to, because she had come to believe there was no way out that he would allow. On the 28th of November 2017, Tarryn Baird was found dead in the garage of the home she shared with her husband in Swindon, Wiltshire. She was 34 years old. She had taken her own life. She left a note for her family. It read, "To my family, I am so sorry, but I just couldn't take it anymore." Christopher Tribus was in Germany when he received the call. He told the court that driving to the airport, he broke down and cried. He said it was the worst day of his life. In the immediate aftermath of Tarryn's death, her passing was treated as a suicide, tragic, sad, but ultimately a private matter. Wiltshire police were made aware of the domestic abuse allegations. They investigated, and then they declined to prosecute Christopher Tribus. The case might have ended there. For many families in that position, it does. But Michelle Baird was not finished. She had buried her daughter. She had sat with the knowledge of what Tarryn had told her, what Tarryn had written, what Tarryn had left behind. And she refused to let it disappear. Nearly 3 years after Tarryn died, Michelle found something while going through her daughter's belongings. It was an audio recording, 4 minutes and 57 seconds long. Tarryn had secretly made it on her phone during an encounter with Christopher, apparently capturing what she believed, or perhaps feared, someone might one day need to hear. The prosecution would describe it as powerful evidence of Christopher Tribus's violent sexual motivation. The defense would say it was a consensual recording of rough sex. That recording would sit at the heart of one of the most difficult and contested trials England and Wales had seen in years. The discovery of that recording triggered a new investigation, this time not by Wiltshire police, but by Dorset police. Fresh eyes, different conclusions. Christopher Tribus was charged with the manslaughter of his wife, 2 counts of rape, and 1 count of coercive and controlling behaviour. The charge of manslaughter was the critical one. Prosecutors were arguing, for the first time in an English or Welsh jury trial, that a man had caused his wife's death by driving her to suicide through a sustained campaign of abuse. No one had ever been convicted by a jury of that charge in these circumstances before. The stakes could not have been higher. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was one that nobody in that courtroom would easily forget. In February 2026, nearly 9 years after Tarryn's death, Christopher Tribus arrived at Winchester Crown Court. He walked in hand with his new wife, Bea, whom he had married in August 2024. He wore a grey suit. He looked like a man who had rebuilt his life. The prosecution was led by Tom Little KC, the most senior criminal prosecutor in the country. Little told the jury that Tribus had subjected Tarryn to extensive and escalating control, coercion, and sexual violence, all of it behind closed doors, all of it over the course of a marriage. He said she had been unable to leave, that she had stopped his control over her in the only way she felt she could. He called it a tsunami. The defence barrister, Katie Thorne KC, offered a completely different version. She told the jury that Christopher had loved and cherished his wife, and that Tarryn, whose PTSD following traumatic carjackings in South Africa was real and documented, had become, in the defence's words, addicted to the attention her allegations brought. The position was plain. He did not beat her, he did not break her, and he did not cause her death. 2 stories, 1 courtroom, 1 woman who was no longer there to speak for herself. The forensic evidence introduced during the trial was among the most disturbing presented in any British courtroom in recent memory. Professor Margaret Stark, the forensic physician, told the jury that Taran Baird's body carried approximately 100 blunt force trauma injuries. She said the injuries to Taran's abdomen were comparable to those she had seen in car crash victims and in fatal strangulation cases. She said that, in over 3 decades of working in forensic medicine, she had rarely, if ever, seen abdominal injuries as severe as those found on Tarryn's body. She refuted the defence's suggestion that the injuries could have been self-inflicted. The defense, for their part, maintained that position. They said Tarryn had a history of self-harm linked to her mental health struggles. They argued that her PTSD, real and documented, had destabilized her perception of her relationship and led her to invent or exaggerate allegations against an innocent husband. They asked the jury to consider whether a man could fairly be expected to answer for the allegations of a woman who was no longer alive to be cross-examined. Katie Thorne, in her closing argument, addressed male jurors and those with sons directly, telling them they might feel very afraid. She asked how Christopher Tribus could be expected to answer what she called the wild allegations of a ghost. Tom Little, in response, accused the defense of conducting a character assassination of a dead woman. He called out what he saw as Christopher's conspicuous lack of anger towards a wife who had allegedly fabricated years of serious abuse against him. He said, with no apparent interest in softening the blow, he is a wife-beater and he raped her on a number of occasions. The jury retired to deliberate. They would spend more than 40 hours working through everything they had heard. 40 hours to weigh a catalogue of injuries, diary entries, audio recordings, medical records, safeguarding files, and the testimony of a husband who said he had loved his wife dearly while she was alive and now found her impossible to be angry at in death. 40 hours to decide whether a woman's last note, "I just couldn't take it anymore," was the consequence of one man's actions, or the tragedy of a woman undone by her own fractured mind. In the end, they came back with a verdict that would reshape the landscape of domestic abuse law in England and Wales, though perhaps not in the way the prosecution had hoped. On the 22nd of April 2026, after more than 40 hours of deliberation, the jury returned their decision. Christopher Tribus was found not guilty of manslaughter, not guilty of 2 counts of rape, not guilty of coercive and controlling behaviour. He looked up at the ceiling and sobbed. From the public gallery, cries of relief were heard. Outside the court, he embraced his new wife, both of them in tears. It was the first time a case of this kind, a husband accused of driving his wife to suicide through domestic abuse, had ever reached a jury in England and Wales, and the jury did not convict. Michelle Baird had sat through 8 weeks of evidence. She had heard her daughter's injuries compared to those of car crash victims. She had listened to that 4-minute, 57-second recording. She watched Christopher Tribus walk free, and she told the press afterward, "What I'm doing is for Tarryn." She was not finished. The Independent Office for Police Conduct announced it was examining how Wiltshire Police had handled Tarryn's case, the same force that had initially declined to prosecute after her death. A domestic homicide review had already flagged the lack of available refuge space at critical moments. The system around Tarryn had seen her. It had named her as high risk. It had failed her anyway, and now it was being asked to explain itself. Tarryn Baird reached out for help 177 times. She saw doctors, spoke to police, wrote it all down, and recorded what she believed was being done to her. She tried to leave and was found. She was told there was no space at the refuge. She left a note that read, "I am so sorry, but I just couldn't take it anymore." No verdict changes any of that. Tarryn left a record precisely because she understood that one day someone might need it. The world heard her, and it is still deciding what to do with what it heard,